Right, hi there. We're talking to Scott Felton today, and this is part of our interview series of discussions. Scott's like third in that series. Yeah, I heard of Scott around for quite some years and emailed him several years ago. I've been on his email list and had a few chats about various things, especially in the Welsh, regards to Welsh cases, because that's what Scott's interested in. Mostly he's known for, especially since a documentary that was shown at the last Leeds Exopolitics event on the Berwyn Mountain case, which is from the 70s, and was actually quite an interesting case that Scott's really up on. So, hi to Scott, thanks for joining us, and do you want to give us a bit of your background, because I don't know too much. I know you run Conway UFO Group. I don't know if you want to say sort of when you got into all this and what you do with that group, and then perhaps go on to say a bit about the main case you studied and the one that you did the documentary on with Richard Hall, which was the Berwyn case. Do you want to give us a little summary of the Berwyn Mountain case, which you're very up on?
Yeah, well, for those who don't know, the Berwyn Mountain UFO event, it's often described as a crash event. I've come to learn in later years, I don't actually believe it was a crash. I think it was just a controlled landing, and in due course the object lifted off the ground and went on its way. But it was quite a while ago now, 23rd of January 1974. There was a series of events went on the same night. There was things like a meteor shower, there was an earth tremor, natural events, and as a result of those natural events, especially the earth tremor, it provoked people into coming out of their homes on what would otherwise be a cold, dark January night. And as a result of people being out and about, certain things were seen, including this object that was perched on the side of a mountain, and other things came to light. For instance, numbers of policemen who seemed to be already in position in a particular village, claims of military personnel being about, and that escalated into things like roadblocks and people being questioned about where they were going on the particular night. And they've got this whole plethora of different things going on.
There was one first-hand witness, wasn't there? Was this the lady that went out with her daughter after seeing it from a house, and was she a nurse or something? I can't remember. Do you want to tell us exactly what she saw? Because her testimony is actually quite vivid still, and I should have mentioned this at the start, but basically, after discussing the Berwyn case, because what that Scott's found is that Andy Roberts, who's a prominent sort of old-school UFOologist, who has links to Dr. David Clarke, who currently is in charge of the National Archives, or does PR for the government for that, and so we're going to go on to say about how disinformation campaigns are spread in ufology, and why a certain two, and you also get a name also including one called Tim Matthews or Tim Heppel, also come up. So you've got a group of three that historically from the 80s have debunked cases, and Scott's ran into this problem with one of these three, linked to David Clarke, which was Andy Roberts. Was I right? Was it a nurse or not? What she saw? Because I thought the way she described it was really quite interesting.
Yeah. Well, there was a local district nurse, Pat Evans, her name is. She's still very much alive, and she still lives in the area. She actually came across the object perched on the side of a mountain, and it was pure, I would say, coincidence that she came across it. But I ultimately found that it was actually because of police incompetence that she actually came across it, because they were obviously involved in trying to stop people moving about, and as a consequence of their own lives, she ended up in a place where she shouldn't have been and came across it. But that's another story. But that was Pat Evans. She was the local district nurse, and she had two daughters who were trained in first aid. And on that particular night, it was just a normal night. No one would have thought anything about it, except that just after 8:30 there was an earth tremor. And the earth tremor took place. It was quite a powerful one for North Wales, and all over the affected area. And the affected area was like went out into England as far as Manchester, 60-mile radius. People came out of their houses in various villages around the Berwyn Mountain range, which is a range of hills about 10 miles long, runs roughly north to south. And people in one particular village, Llanrhichlo, they saw lights on the mountain, couple that with the idea of this earthquake, and there was also an explosion sound reported amongst the rumblings. And when they came out of the houses in Llandrillo, they saw lights on the side of the mountain, and quickly concluded that in fact they thought a plane had crashed. Now this was on one mountain in a particular part of the range. In the next village, which was 3 miles away, Llanderfel, Pat Evans is the nurse. That's where she lived. She also suffered the effects of the earthquake, the earth tremor, and this was about 20 to 9. She spent the next sort of 3/4 of an hour trying to ring the police because all the phone lines were jammed, and eventually just before 9:30 got through to the police in headquarters at Colwyn Bay up on the coast. Now by then they'd already organised a major incident log because they thought it was a crash in one part of the range, and she said who she was and what her status was, and she offered her assistance. Now by 9:10, a good 15 minutes before she even spoke to the police had already authorised local officers, and who turned out actually to be drafted in policemen who were already in position to go up and look for this suspected plane crash.
How do you know how many hours after that was since Pat Evans saw the actual craft on this what was the side of a hill, if I remember?
Yeah, well, that was just before 10 p.m. She spoke to the police just about 9:30. Right. The police already knew where they thought a suspected plane crash had happened, and they thought casualties. They accepted her offer of medical assistance, bearing in mind this was a major incident log was opened, and they thought could have been casualties in a possible quite a large plane crash. However, everything the police did was very, very peculiar because it defied all logic about how you would deal with a major incident of that sort of magnitude, even though they did open a major incident log. And the strange thing was, they accepted her offer of help, but they didn't tell her where to go to.
Right.
So she took a particular road over the mountain range, which turned out to be 5 miles from where the police were searching, and came across this big object on the side of the hill, about a mile off the road she was on. And of course she stopped sort of in amazement. She had the 2 daughters where they were witnesses. The debunkers have actually always made it look like it was her in the car on her own. They very rarely mentioned the daughters, basically to try and dilute her testimony. In fact, there are 3 witnesses, herself, 2 daughters. She watched it for a while, drove on, turned round, came back and watched it for a bit longer. That took her to about 10:15, and then she saw small lights zigzagging towards the object. Now she thought that whatever it was on the mountain. She didn't think it was a plane crash because it was just like this consistent moon-shaped glow, but it was changing in colour, orange, yellows, sort of red, that type thing. She didn't know what it was, but when she saw these little lights zigzagging towards her, she thought it was some sort of rescue party or, the authorities. So she couldn't do anything because it was a mile across country anyway, treacherous country. So she just basically about turned and went home. And from her point of view, nothing really happened until the next day. There's some conjecture over that now because there are rumours that she received some sort of payments to change her story at a later date. But at the time, she saw this, her daughter saw it, and they could do nothing about it. So they actually went home, and that was the end of it, as far as they were concerned. But that didn't last long because they got caught up in all this UFO stuff within 24 hours. It turned out, in my research, is that these little lights weren't police torches at all, although it was portrayed as police torches by Andy Roberts, because he fabricated a story about them meeting the poachers, and this big object she saw was a poacher's lamp. It was absolute rubbish. And I found in my research is that in fact the evidence points to these lights were actually torches of a military unit that was approaching the object.
Well, just clear up then. Do you think the police were told to? It sounded to me like there was some sort of radar tracking. The police knew about it when she called, and as you say, didn't then send us to the right location, despite saying, yeah, you're okay to go there and help. So what confuses me is, how come if the police knew about it and you say they were quite prepared, why weren't the cops there either before she arrived or when, or while she was looking at this light on the side? What do you think happened? Do you think the police stand down and the military turned up? What happened?
No, the military were already there.
Right,
And
did she know they were there?
no, the
Right.
military were already there, and
How do you know this?
because the military were actually approaching this object within a short space of time. The object, we've dug up other witnesses now, which actually basically saw this thing land. I mean, that Pat Evans in there, she never saw it land, she never saw it take off, but she did miss it taking off by within 10 minutes.
That's right. Yeah, I remember.
She's actually stated this. She was sorry that she never stayed around longer,
Yeah.
and she would have seen this thing lift off. But other witnesses since then come forward. I tracked some down who vanished, who Margaret Fry knew about, and we found them, and eventually they turned up in Richard Hall's documentary.
Right.
They basically sort of controlled landing. But what was interesting is that within a short space of time, when this earthquake took place at 20 to 9, roughly, the police were in numbers already in that particular village in the local police station. So the question had to be asked, well, why were all these policemen already there? And also, crucially, they weren't local. They've all been...
They've been drafted in. That's really unusual. That takes a lot of organising usually.
Yeah, well, they were already there. But the locals in the village didn't know they were there. And this earthquake, which no one could have predicted, basically flushed them out.
Right.
Now, the police who were in the village, I've come to conclude that they were just ordinary bobbies. They'd been drafted in. They could have been told a load of rubbish about why they were actually there. I believe they were there because if the public got to know about an operation that was going on in the mountains involving the military, their job would have been to interfere with the public.
Right.
As it happens, this air tremor happens, coincidental, I believe, and as a result of that, and the locals all ringing into the police and saying, well, we think there's a plane crash here, and the switchboards were jammed anyway because of the earthquake, the police had no choice but to open a major incident log and send some officers up onto the mountain to look for this suspected plane, which had nothing to do with the UFO. It was a totally different tangent. And where this alleged plane might have crashed was a good 4 miles from where the UFO was. It was on a totally different mountain in the range.
Right. Interesting.
Now, in the end, in this concoction by Andy Roberts, he moved events on the mountain called Cadabronwen, which is above the village of Llandrillo where the police were, and he moved them to 4 miles to the neighbouring mountain, Cadaberwyn, to explain away what Pat Evans saw. Now, what the villagers saw in Llandrillo when they came out of the houses, they saw lights on the mountain, but they turned out to be the lamp. That turned out to be the lamp of a group of lads who were all hunting rabbits. They were lamping the rabbits in the dark and shooting them. And that was pure coincidence. What actually happened with Andy Roberts, he took the poachers' story because it couldn't be disputed. They were there.
Yeah.
He moved their lamp in his ignorance, because he didn't understand the actual method of lamping rabbits and hares and whatnot at night.
Okay.
He moved them to the neighbouring mountain and said their lamp was what Pat Evans saw. And then he fabricated a story that the police conducted a foot search with torches because he knew and couldn't dispute that police had gone up the mountain looking for this plane. So he took their actions, said that he invented a story that they did a foot search, and not only that, but enlarged it further and said that these little lights, these torch lights which Pat Evans saw, were police torches, and they not only met with the poachers, but they stopped and spoke with them.
Right.
But it never happened.
No.
The police never met the poachers, and also they were on a neighbouring mountain anyway.
Well,
4 miles, count for what she saw.
yeah. Well, you think someone as local as Pat Evans would know exactly what mountain to report and to say that she saw this thing on.
Oh yeah,
If you've
yeah.
lived in an area, and people that come from sort of valleys and rural areas have got sort of different mindset to towny people, and they get to know landscapes very well. If you've lived in a certain area and driven around it, then you know that. The one thing I wanted to point out: do you still believe today that? And because I would say that based on what we're about to discuss, to do related to both Andy Roberts and David Clark, we also found this with the Rendlesham case, that just by moving, which Colonel Holt did, not any suspicions him, by moving one of the dates, just tweaking a date and a few times a little bit on the 3-day period of Rendlesham, it threw out researchers for years. So do you still today believe, based on what I think we've discussed off this recording briefly regards to Andy Roberts, that he uses certain, let's say, what could be classed as intelligence or disinformation tactics? Do you still believe that he believes that the mountain was actually used, or is your opinion today that that was a piece of disinformation to throw people off the
I
scene?
believe, I from what I've discovered since with documents I eventually got my hands on, which Andy Roberts claimed he had access to, and which various people in the British Geological Survey frustrated me for 2 years getting. He knew, I believe he knew from day one all the true facts about the Berwyn event. There was no dispute. I don't believe there's any dispute about that. He knew there was a UFO on the side of Berwyn, on the slopes of Berwyn. He knew, because he had access to all the records, everything that went on surrounding the event, all the actual stuff, all the peripheral stuff. He knew that, and out of that, he concocted a story to rubbish the UFO event. And relied on documents and maps and all sorts of things which he had access to, which no one else had access to, and he relied on others then to refuse access to those documents so that he could get away with what he said.
Yeah, I wanted to go into the British Geological Survey because that, I think, is highly significant given what you had to do to get those documents. Just before we move on to that bit and we move on to sort of that second phase of what we're going to talk about, it's interesting. We've got, you can correct me if I'm right, I think Jenny Randall's claimed that these things. The problem is, like you say, what a weird coincidence that you have a sort of mini quake in that area on the same night or the same day, because of course when you have geological or what are essentially magnetic instances taking place within the earth and stuff, then you do actually, there is a phenomena which people, debunkers use, and is a real phenomena, that you start getting like these mini aurora borealis things, so you start getting lights coming off the ground.
Lights.
Is that what? Yeah, is that what they're called? Yeah, and I think
Yeah.
I think Jenny Randall said that Berwyn was linked to that. I think she claims, or someone that has done that. So I mean, given that we've now got the theory that, right, so it could have been the quake again to do with these electromagnetic lights. It
Yeah.
could be a crash of either a UFO or a plane, depending on who you talk to. And then on top of that, there's what was that? Oh, the third one, of course, is the poacher's lamp was what was creating. Poachers use these. If anyone doesn't know or is listening outside the UK, then lamping is uses really powerful, usually on the side of a Land Rover, but if not, you can get these sort of million watts, million candle watt, whatever they're called, million candle power lamps that essentially, I think they're made to sort of they highlight the animals' eyes up and make them stand there, then they get shot basically. But so these lamps are really bright, but again, you've got to imagine then that would someone like Pat Evans, who was used to the ways of the countryside, used to viewing things like lamping and poaching taking place, would she mistake a poacher's lamp for standing and staring at what
She never actually knew it was a poacher's lamp one way or the other.
No, I meant she would be aware of what a poacher's lamp was in comparison to what she
Oh
saw
yeah,
on the high
yeah,
hillside.
she would. But I was fortunate. I've had an advantage over Andy Roberts because I'm interested in two things, which Andy probably regrets. One, I'm interested. I've always been interested in the native languages of the British Isles, and Welsh is my particular forte in Welsh language. Now, it's very, very important to note that at the time, in '74, and still the case today, the vast majority of people in this particular area, their first language is Welsh. They sleep, eat, dream, everything they do is in Welsh as the first language. They're all bilingual, but they all speak English more or less perfectly, but everything they do is through the medium of Welsh. And more so in 1974. All the villages there, they didn't suffer then like they do now with influxes of incomers from England, for instance, and it changed the statistics of the numbers of people who speak Welsh in the villages. But they all discussed the Berwyn events, if you like, through their own language. And when they were interviewed by people like Jenny Vandals, who did visit the area on at least one occasion, I know she was on with a Geiger counter at one point. When she speaks to these people, they're quite chatty. They'll tell her what they know, what they think they saw, or what they did see. But it's never as graphic in English as it is in their own language.
That makes total sense.
Yeah, because they're more confident when they're speaking about it, you see. They can communicate better. So things are lost in translation. And of course, when the authorities got involved with things like mopping up bits of information that might be fair to everything, they always did it looking for things that were in English. And as a consequence, they've never actually mopped up anything that's in Welsh. You know, the locals still talk about things and about things in the event, but through Welsh, and we've never actually tried to crush any belief in the Berwyn in Welsh as they have done in English. You know, I mean, Andy Roberts is incapable of rubbing the locals in their own language. He has to do it in English, and he doesn't have the effect he thinks he does. With Jenny Randall, so she visited the area with a Geiger counter. Now, she actually searched the area where a plane was suspected of crashing. She doesn't appear to have gone anywhere near the mountain where Andy Roberts moved events to. And her reasoning behind that, she was also an earthlight enthusiast, was she searched a stone circle. This just happened to be above the village. Now, whether she is one of these people who thinks that stone circles and ancient monuments have got something to do with aliens and UFOs and things, I don't know. But it seemed bizarre to me when I looked into it that she was basically disregarding the testimony of Pat Evans. Right. Pat Evans was 5 miles away. She was on. There was only two roads, two B roads, because it's such a remote area, and there's no dispute over where Pat Evans was. Yet Jenny Randall seems to have dismissed her testimony and concentrated on the part of the mountain where the police were. So she was basically saying, well, the police were there, and the Air Force, some Air Force personnel searched this particular area the following day as well, accompanied again by the police. So the police were there, they must have been right, and she must have been wrong. And any lights she saw, Pat Evans saw, must have been lights she saw 5 miles away. You know, it's just totally ludicrous. Yeah. And in fact, when you do go to where Pat Evans was on the road, you can see quite easily that where Jenny Randall was searching, because of the undulations in the mountains and the hills, it was totally impossible for any UFO to have been where Jenny Randall searched and be visible from the road 5 miles away. It's just not possible.
Yeah. And it's interesting, of course, that or recently in comparison to her other work, that Jenny Randalls has now written, I think, a total of 2 books, with one of which with just David Clarke, I think, and one with David Clarke and Roberts, who we're sort of discussing as part of this. So it just seems strange that's.
Well, you have to remember, because Jenny Randalls was promoted the idea of a UFO event for years against Roberts and Clarke, who were
at Berwyn, you mean?
Yeah, but she right. basically she was saying that the locals were mistaken. There was an event, but it was an earthlight event. Right. Again, what she actually did was the claimed epicenter of the earth tremor was about 5,000 meters below the town of Bala, but that was actually the best part of 10 miles, 8 to 10 miles away from Bala, where this UFO event and where Jenny Vandals was searching. So what she was trying to say was, although the epicenter was 8 to 10 miles away, the earth lights just conveniently happened to pop up on the mountain where there was a UFO seen. She conveniently forgets, and has conveniently forgotten, how far away the epicenter actually was.
Right. You probably know a bit about this because you applied to. I think you said that you had read or spoken to Andy Roberts about him claiming to have certain documents that you then found out were from the British Geological Survey, who were obviously investigating this issue on a geological sort of quake level. And then do you want to tell us what happened that when you heard that Andy Roberts had got these, and he claimed that no one else had got them? So of course that got you all back up a bit, and you decided to have a go using basic, requests, or I don't know whether it's freedom of information or whatever document requests from the BGS. Do you want to just give us a couple of minutes on what happened with regards to you trying to get those documents to get more clarification on that whole incident with regards to what they'd found out about the possibility of it being a quake?
Yeah. Well, if you go online and search Berwyn UFO events, 101 different sources will come up, all emanating back to Andy Roberts. Going back to this piece he's written, which he describes as far as he's concerned the official version of events, is Welsh Roswell and his account of what really happened. And if you read through all that information, he openly claims that he'd had access at the time when he wrote it to British Geological Survey records, which, because there was an earthquake that night, the British Geological Survey sent a team of men up there to question the locals. This was standard practice, and he issued questionnaires and about what they felt. And bearing in mind this was 74, it's not as technical then as it is now, but it was standard practice then. And of course, Andy Roberts openly claims this in his tome, and he's claimed he was the first person, and it's there clearly visible on all the sites to read. He claims he was the first person to inspect these records, and they'd lain gathering dust for X number of years. And he claimed it was a revelation when he read them. It proved this and it proved that, and there couldn't possibly be a UFO event. So I read this and I thought, well, I want a piece of that. I contacted the British Geological Survey a couple of times, and they just ignored me to start with. So that annoyed me. So I filed a freedom of information request and got nowhere with that. And I was eventually approached by a guy called Dr. Roger Musson, and he appears to have been in charge of these files from 1974. But of course those files were records of what people heard and saw at the time, and there were maps mentioned, and I thought, well, these maps. Anyway, Musson basically told me that there were no such documents and no such maps. He actually said that to me in an email. I queried it and said, well, Roberts is saying there is, and he said he's had access. But he didn't even qualify that. He didn't say, oh, well, Roberts is wrong or Roberts is a liar. He just ignored it, because basically he couldn't say anything against Andy Roberts, because what Andy Roberts was claiming was actually true. He had access to these documents. So anyway, I was getting nowhere with Musson. He was a total arse. So in the end, I just filed a complaint against him. Official complaint. That he'd been obstructing me, he was lying, and of course I was able to produce what Andy Roberts had claimed in my defence, and saying, well, look, this guy's claiming these records exist, and this guy who's waiting for you says it isn't. I believe he's obstructing me. I believe these documents do exist. And with that, there's a big inquiry, because Musson's like running his own show there, and of course the directors in the BGS, they didn't know what he was up to. Of course, he got caught out then, because I pushed it further than anyone else had ever pushed it. No one ever questioned them. Or no one was prepared to have a go at them, and I was. I'm always up for a scrap in that respect. And all of a sudden there's an internal investigation. And with that, in the post, I get this letter of, not so much an apology, but yeah, we've investigated this, and there are documents, which basically made out Musson to be a total liar. But of course, because he was one of their own, they did defend him, and they tried to make out it was a mistake. And I hadn't made myself clear about what I wanted, which was totally ludicrous. I'd approached them several times, and it was sold out. And I even provided them with a photocopy of the page of Roberts' write-up, which actually mentioned this particular document. So there couldn't have been any dispute over the clarity of the request. And eventually, these documents turned up. And of course, what Andy Roberts claimed to be a revelation was a revelation to me, because it clearly showed such things as where these poachers were with their lamp, where the anomalous object was, the UFO, where Pat Evans was, and he'd had access to all this information, and basically just moved things around, moved events at point A to point B, ignored point C, just to create a debunking picture.
Why did the British Geological Survey have documents based, if they were just there to study the Earth, the geological issues, why would they have information on positions of poachers and that sort of thing?
Well, they were witnesses to the event.
Oh, were they working there at the time then?
Yeah, they were actually on the mountains.
Right, I thought they were using some equipment at some university and were doing it all from that or something.
They were actually on the mountain poaching. Right. They were on the mountain at 8 o'clock in the evening. Now, another mistake Andy Roberts made is that in the 70s, these lamps were crude affairs made out of car headlamps and heavy car batteries, and they had a battery drain of less than an hour if you were conservative with the juice. And Andy, in his total ignorance, forgot this. So they're flashing their lamp round at 20 to 9 when the earth tremor struck. People come out the house and see the lamp, and tied it in with a rumbling sound, an explosion sound, and assumed they were the lights off a plane, that it crashed into the mountain. But they were actually on the mountain when the earth tremor struck. So they were prime targets for the British Geological Survey for questionnaires, and they were sort of questioned casually about what they experienced and what did they see anything in that, and all this sort of stuff. But the questions you were asked were no different to what anyone else was asked across the affected area, because they said where they were when the earth tremor struck, and it was recorded officially on a map. It was damning evidence against Andy Roberts, because he knew where they were. He knew exactly where they were on this map because he'd seen the maps. But he thought no one would get access to that map. So he said, I'll move these now to the neighbouring mountain and say their lamp was what Pat Evans saw. But in his ignorance, what he didn't realise is that lamping, whether your lamp's attached to a vehicle or whether you've got it in your hand, it's a highly mobile activity. You move around into the wind and you sweep the lamp left to right, looking for your targets. Yeah, he didn't know that. So when this static object was on the side of the mountain, which Pat Evans saw, which was there for, in her case, a good 20 minutes, it was not a poacher's lamp. And because I've been in the trade, I'm a gamekeeper by trade, and I've been involved in field sports since I was a kid. I knew about lamping, and as soon as I read Andy's report and said it was a poacher's lamp, I thought that's just totally ludicrous, because it's a static light, and lampers aren't static; they're moving about constantly.
And that's what I meant when I said even someone like Pat Evans, who might not be like have sort of your background in
she would have known. She would have known what a poacher's lamp was. Yeah.
Well, it's just insulting to say. It's insulting of Andy Roberts to claim, and Jenny Randalls to claim that a nurse, whoever turned up that couldn't tell the difference between a huge object on the side of a mountain that looks strange and out of place, and then some field sports, hunting lamps. It's insulting. One thing that I don't think you mentioned, but I think we discussed before. So you found out Roberts was friends with the guy, this doctor who you met at the who refused you the documents that the British Geological Survey. He's also a Fortean. He's a reader of Fortean topics and stuff. Was that true?
Yeah, I was actually at the time. This is at the very early days of me getting involved with the Berwyn case. I was finding my way. I was green and naive, and I was tentatively feeling my way about. I was going through all this stuff that was online, and a lot of it was disinformation, deliberately put there to muddy the waters. I've discovered that since. Loads of dead ends, and they're just there to frustrate people who might want to look into the case. So I was going up these cul-de-sacs and coming back out and going up the next cul-de-sac, and I joined, in my ignorance, I joined Joe McGonigal's internet forum. It was called Ufology in UK. Now, I'd never met Andy Roberts in any shape or form till then. And, of course, I started asking questions, pretty naive questions, really. I was on the first rung of the ladder, so to speak. And I don't know this guy. He jumps in, and I'm getting savaged left, right, and centre by this guy. And in some cases, he was getting quite aggressive, because I don't take savaging like that lightly. and I'll just keep bouncing back with more questions. And it seemed to be aggravating. But what I noticed was that no one else ever came back at me. It was Andy Roberts. Any question about the bearing, no one came back except Andy Roberts, and he seemed to have an answer for everything. And that got me suspicious, because I'd already read his debunking piece, and I knew that a lot of the facts in it, before I even had proof, a lot of the facts were just ludicrous, like the poacher's lamp.
Also, I just wanted to point out, before we carry on, that it's just weird, and it is classic disinformation sort of 101, that you appeal to both sides in some way, and then you collapse the story. You collapse the main narrative of the story, the one that makes the most sense, is probably most valid, by adding other bits on, switching a few things around. But you've got this basic dichotomy in the way Roberts sees the Berwyn case. It's, in one sense, like you said, he was into it before you. He titles it and calls it the Welsh Roswell, and as if trying to get that sort of attention going towards the case. But on another hand, he's prepared to reduce it all to people misidentifying poachers' lambs. So that's strange. And then, like you say, although he's come to that conclusion that basically nothing was going on, it was most probably a poacher's lamp, he then carries on attacking anyone that comes close to trying to add more investigation skills and basically look at the case again from a slightly different angle.
You can draw a conclusion about any particular subject from information that's available, even if it's the wrong conclusion. And in the case of what Andy Roberts has done with the Berwyn case, he never wrongly concluded from the information he had available. He invented the conclusion, basically to rubbish anyone who might have been interested in the case, But it was on that internet. It was on that internet forum. I happened to mention about Musson being obstructive, and Andy Roberts jumped in to defend him and said, "Oh yeah, he's a good friend of mine, and we're fellow 14s."
Right.
And then alarm bells started to ring. I think, hang on, Roberts is saying this, Musson's saying a totally different thing. One is defending the other. And of course, that ultimately led to the complaint against Musson.
Yeah, what strikes me as interesting about that is that although you can say these two people were friends, and so on some level, then if that doctor that you mentioned, Dr. Musson, wasn't working for a public body, which I think that they are a public funded body. Then,
oh yeah, he's paid by the taxpayer. Yeah.
Right. Well, so if it was a private sort of group or something, that's okay for him to withhold documents. He won't do that. But the fact that he allowed Andy Roberts, which undoubtedly seemed to happen, to influence him into holding back documents, providing them to Andy Roberts, but then holding them back for the likes of you or anyone else that may have wanted them, because we're guessing basically that evidence had been used to basically scupper the case. And that, of course, there wasn't just they didn't want you to find out the bits that are in there. It's because that would also reveal the fact that Roberts had lied. Was that your take on it?
No, that was the case, yeah. Musson was basically there to obstruct anyone who might have inquired and tried to access the documents, because the documents told a truth about what went on that night. But Andy Roberts had actually taken the facts, manipulated them, invented them, in some cases, like the police talk to the poachers to explain away torches and things, torchlights. And he relied on Musson then to make sure no one ever got the documents that he referred to, in order that his lies couldn't be disproved.
That sort of fits into this idea of changing things at the start, fits into this whole pattern of disinformation. And I just want to briefly mention another case then that sort of links into this and sort of highlights these sort of tactics, and then we'll go on, because there's a bit more stuff that you've got to say on the Berwyn and the stuff that's linked to Roberts and things. But it now seems that we know from the books they've authored and from statements they made that Dr. David Clark, who's basically used to work for, I think, the Sheffield Star newspaper, and now is a lecturer at Sheffield Uni. He's got he's got a PhD in folklore, which I always thought was quite funny, given that he actually is now in charge of the official National Archives files on UFOs, and basically does their promotion and PR for them. And it's just funny that they find someone that's got a folklore degree, because that they like it's quite handy for them to insinuate that, of course, all this stuff to do with ETs and various paranormal phenomena is all based on folklore and
as everyone knows, the Bourbon Mountain Range and probably Rendlesham as well is full of little toadstools in the woods with little gnomes and fishing rods sitting on them.
Of course, no, of course they were. It's good. I forgot to say that, but good on you for being persistent and keep going. And you're right, quite rightly putting in a complaint against a public body. And thank God there was someone there. It wasn't totally controlled to the point where a director, probably out of embarrassment and stuff, and thinking they might end up getting this might end up being a really big issue, then
Well,
stepped in.
I don't think the directors knew what was going on. I think this was a private affair between Musson and Roberts. Because don't forget, that Welsh Mountain tome that Andy Roberts constructed to explain away the event, that was in circulation for several years before I got involved. And it would be totally ludicrous to claim that in all that time it was in the public domain and being promoted by Andy Roberts, that Musson, who allowed Andy Roberts access to the information, that he didn't know that this had been fabricated, because even Dr. Roger Musson must have known the content of those documents, and he therefore must have known that Andy Roberts had fabricated a story around them. So he was, as far as I'm concerned, a co-conspirator.
Yeah, and again, they're in a professional capacity. That makes it all the more important that this stuff gets sort of found out, and someone like you persists to try and make sure that those sort of private arrangements don't go on. But all I want to point out for anyone listening that thinks, that might have just been a general, an agreement between two people, and there was nothing really much more to it. Then bear in mind of what I said about the whole Rendlesham Forest and many other UFO cases or alleged UFO cases that then have sort of just simple things. If you're there, from what I've seen over the years, if you're there at the start of an incident and you get hold, as Andy Roberts did, of documents which reveal perhaps more fully what probably went on than anyone's seen so far, then not only will you try and obstruct people then getting that information, but you will then duplicate that information, but you'll then put your own framework on it, twist a few things. You only need to change a date, a few hours here and there, make a light on the side of the mountain, then become focus of the police and everything else, and make it seem like it was a poacher's lamp. And these little changes then have a life of their own. You see the way the internet works, especially, and that works. It worked before the internet as well. That these stories then propagate themselves. I wanted to point out if people think that was just just a one-off example, very rarely do we hear about confirmed cases of disinformation agents, as it's commonly known on the internet, or what I probably prefer to call, if they can be proven that way, are state assets. That's a proper political term for these. These are people that essentially either some branch of the government or the MOD pays in some way to either inform on people or to obfuscate data and twist stories. And we have one, a magazine that ran. It's called War with the Universe, was a special issue, but it's run by a guy called Larry O'Hara, who wrote a magazine that's been around for ages, pre-internet days, which is called Notes from the Borderland. And they basically did two huge articles on how ufology in the UK had been infiltrated. No one's done any stuff like this, and we actually find out when we look at that an ex-National Front member called Tim Heppel, later changed because all the hassle after that, changed his name to Matthews, basically moved from the National Front. At some point then must have come across police or Ministry of Defence, government, whatever it was, and then he slowly moves his way into ufology, and the data against him, he also in the 80s and 90s, more in the 90s, started to infiltrate green anarchist groups and things like that. So a classic example of a state asset. And again, why move people from these areas, from the National Front, and then from infiltrating green and anarchist movements into then ufology? What was it about that the government in the 90s was interested in having someone there present that could then actually act on their behalf in certain ways? So if anyone wants to look him up, there's articles on the Ex-Politics UK website. If you didn't have a look around, Tim Heppel or Tim Matthews, and you'll find information about him and some of the stuff that he actually got up to. But the point that links in with Scott's case is, of course, Andy Roberts. Most people will be aware of David Clark. Well, Roberts, I think Scott will agree, seems to be like David Clark's poodle or sidekick, and is basically sent out to do certain things, and Clark seems to be the one that gets the bits of information for state size, let's say, and then Roberts goes out and does the odd thing, whether it's attacking people on the internet, that he seems to be very efficient at, or actually doing things more in personal, writing books that cover things in a certain way. But I wanted to just briefly mention a case, and then go back to Scott for some feedback if anything links up to his case. I was going to list some points of what counts as sort of disinformation and these classic state actors, but there's a guy called Max Burns that basically looked into the Sheffield Triangle incident, which basically, I'm not going to go into it too much. All that was that there was the Sheffield case involved a black triangle. It was around the time the flaps in Britain and Belgium of these flying triangle, which presumed to be military. Some said to be ET, but presumably mostly the smaller ones certainly are perhaps military technology. And following or chasing, whether in a support mode or actually chasing for some other reason, was what I think was a Hurricane jet fighter, which was then seen by several witnesses to crash, to the point where a witness was seen covered in, I presume pilot was seen covered in sort of diesel petrol fumes, lost in the vicinity of where this plane was thought to have gone down. And now, probably because this involved the military, Clark jumped straight on this, and Max Burns has had a huge problem with this. That's basically involved. He started to get in touch with David Clark. He was in touch with both him and Roberts, but in the process, again, you can find all this story online. And Max also gave a talk at the recent X Politics. Hello.
Hi, David. We got cut off there.
No, that my router just popped out, and so that everything went off. And then I'll just get rid of that. Where was I? I don't know where it cut off, but
You just said he'd been found with some covering fuel, and
right.
he started having problems after he reported this plane possibly chasing a triangle.
All right, I'll do the Max Burns thing, because then I think what it will make people see is then what happens with you and Roberts is like a drop in the ocean, really. And if you know any more bits that after that, if you want to bring them back in, but it's the case against Clark. When you read again, when I reread Max's stuff, it's just phenomenal. But no wonder I was really pissed off with David Clark at a certain point. Remember, but let's carry on. So basically, a witness that then eventually seemed to get under a lot of pressure from the likes of David Clark, Andy Roberts, with this guy Tim Heppel, who was also still involved. He didn't disappear. He then moved into doing his whole talks on sort of Nazi technology and Nazi discs, which will. So you've got this group of three with Roberts, David Clark, and this Tim Heppel, who used to do the conferences. And basically his pitch was, everything was Nazi terrestrial tech, and we'll see at the end that this is a developing pattern that these people seem to want to make everything about it, that it's all a terrestrial military phenomena in some way, or it's Nazi this, or it's Black Project this, and that seems to be their meta. You could say that's their meta role or meta narrative to this whole thing, is to reduce everything to that sort of situation. So anyway, back to the Max Burns case. Great researcher, spent a lot of time on this Sheffield case. So as I say, one witness saw someone around in the area covered in jet fuel, smelt of it, and when Max tried to then interview him, this guy had a phone call which involved David Clark, to my knowledge, in some way, and the guy then didn't want to speak yet, wouldn't make the same statement that he'd made to, I think it was Max Burns previously. When Max then wanted it brought out and recorded, whether it was on a radio show or something, the guy would not come out and say that. And in fact, Nick Pope also waded in, thanks to David Clark contacting him, and Nick Pope was saying it's ludicrous that a pilot would be walking away from his crash site. He'd stay there for the rescue mission, because of course Nick's got this MOD knowledge. Well, there are several cases when that wouldn't happen. If your plane was in tatters, or as may well have happened, we think, in that area, then there's many peat bogs around there, and it's possible that many things have been lost, huge items have been lost in those. So don't know, but Max Burns became a victim probably because he took on a case that involved a Hurricane plane. Governments were very paranoid about these black triangles, because of course the vast majority of them didn't know what these flying triangles that were going in the 90s, that were flying all over, certainly lots in Britain, lots in Scotland, lots in Britain, and of course Belgium as well, and other areas. So if they were terrestrial technology or derived from ET, whatever they were, then I think the governments around the world were very keen on keeping this hushed up, despite the fact that someone was flying these above our heads, and there's lots of footage around of those. So Max was severely targeted. At the time he was sort of a rave DJ and stuff, but he was essentially stopped, and he's told me about this firsthand. I asked him about this situation. he was stopped, his car was searched, and he went back to the footwell to find lots of a certain rave drug all over the footwell of the car. And after they'd taken all the people out of the car that he was in, and the police then took them back. And Max claims that these ecstasy tablets were then all over the footwell of the car. And as he said to me, who drives around, with an illegal drug all over, spread over the footwell of your car? Well, it just doesn't happen. Seems a very honest guy to me. So if he said there's something fishy about it, then I believe him. But that wasn't the end of his hassle. He ended up doing a 30-month trial for that particular incident, and I think that linked with one of his first talks on this issue. It's literally like a few days or weeks later after one of his first talks on this incident. But in addition to that, he tried to maintain contact with both Clark and Roberts to an extent, and he had nothing but hassle from them. David Clark he used to go and visit him in the Sheffield Star offices, and he said David Clark often came back really angry. He used to go out of the room, come back even more angry that Max was still going on about this issue. And if you're a rational person and you think a case is not what it's meant to be, and someone's saying, "Oh, well, it is this," and then David Clark assumes, "Well, it's not," he's more of a skeptic, then you don't get angry about those situations. You just, most people that have got different opinions, just actually go, they sort of go with it and go, right, well, obviously we've got different opinions on what actually went down here. Well, you've got to ask yourself, why is David Clark disappearing, then coming back and being more angry and taking what Max claims were staged arguments with him over this Sheffield triangle incident. But get this, in addition to this, we've got no link, I don't think, between Clark or Roberts and the actual the drugs raid that Max underwent while he was researching the initial stages of the Flying Triangle. But we do then have a situation where a local council was said to have got in touch with David Clark to ask the whereabouts of Max. They want to know for council tax reasons, allegedly. This was all confirmed by a fax which David Clark showed to someone, that David Clark then gave the full data that Max had just dropped off his new location, and David Clark then faxed back the full details, without even asking Max. The new details of his address and phone number he then passed on to the council. Max was then arrested again. Again, also unusual. Many people, whether it's the poll tax, the old poll tax, or what then shifted into the council tax, many people are either didn't pay that probably around that time, or were in arrears with it, or whatever. And he would also, I believe, faced a prison sentence again for that. He was certainly arrested and held for a while. And David Clark admitted that he sent this fax back. None of his business, but he's happy to send faxes back with people's information on it. The Sheffield incident was also investigated by the News of the World, and Max was visited by the News of the World, and they were going to do a full couple of pages on this incident, and Max was going to give the main bit of evidence. And during the interview, somehow David Clark had been told or had found out. Max claims he never told a soul. The interview was arranged within 2 days. 2 days later, he was there with this News of the World reporter. A phone call goes while perhaps he was in the News of the World offices. I have to check. Perhaps he'd gone down to London. But the phone goes. The journalist disappears, comes back, and he finds out that David Clark had been on the phone, basically, essentially slagging off Max and his research tactics. And guess what? That full page spread, 2-page spread, never went out after that in the News of the World, because Dave Clark had made sure that this journalist knew that Max was a good-for-nothing druggy type, and his research was off the wall and of no use. So Dave Clark doing that. There are several other instances as well, where Dave Clark, one particular one, with regard the base where these Hurricane aircraft that were chasing these triangles supposedly took off from, that Max had been and spoken to one of the lady who was the PR woman at the base, and anyway, then Clark then writes in a report that Max had never been to the base, and that was supported by this woman. So the PR woman, I presume was maybe a military officer, I don't know, also denied Max having ever turned up, even though he'd got documents saying he'd been there, and a recorded telephone conversation of the conversations with this woman. So again, David Clark seemed to have quite a range of quite a few methods of being able to put pressure on both structures and people to actually not discuss certain things, or to warp situations in a certain way, to the point where he can get the main PR person for a full-on airfield and military base to completely change the story and essentially lie to the public and claim that people like Max haven't been and spoken to her, and of course that's you know, it's if you can do that sort of thing, you've got to ask how someone like David Clarke, who's essentially an ex-journalist, come a folklore lecturer at Sheffield University, how come he's suddenly in a position where he can make those sort of decisions, manages to get whereabouts of people, sends faxes off with people's details, and then manages to get military institutions to completely change their story and basically lie for people. So we've got lots of stuff, and you know, Clarke and Roberts, who Scott linked with, worked together for years, written loads of books together, and you know, you've got the case. The one thing I want to mention also with God, Andy Roberts, is of course he's weighed in numerous ones. We could probably find endless cases where he's weighed in and claimed that people were hallucinating. One of the big things with Andy Roberts, interestingly, given that they essentially him and Clarke essentially made sure Max got a criminal record for this whatever happens in the drug situation, but Roberts himself has also got a drug conviction from 1976, which he was very careful about making sure it didn't get out until Larry O'Hara and Max did the work and basically confronted him with this, and then he admitted this, that he was also he had a 3-month suspended sentence in 1976 for possession of amphetamine and cannabis, I think, and he's got an interest in this whole. I don't judge anyone on their drug intake. I think if you can operate as a normal, friendly, social person, you get your work you want to get done, and you're not out causing problems. I don't have a problem with what anyone does and puts into their body, but it's just interesting. It seems that someone with Andy Roberts' background, who's also written a book called Albion Dreaming, all about the influence of psychedelic substances on Britain, written a sort of book on that angle, is prepared to use the drugs issues. He's also prepared to use the issues of hallucinations. Again, this whole insinuation that someone is schizophrenic or on drugs, or can't perceive reality properly. There's it's a clever word, use of hallucination. That's one of Roberts's favourite words, and one as Scott will know, because every time it comes up with Roberts or Clarke, I get annoyed. The one case I got annoyed at was because it destroyed his life. Was Alan Godfrey, who was the Todmorden police officer whose Panda car essentially had a Crafts land in front of it. The guy was then abducted, but Roberts essentially wrote, basically told that the guy was hallucinating, had the audacity to claim that this serving police officer, who was literally 20-30 feet away from a UFO that actually burnt the tarmac underneath it, that he was actually seeing a double-decker bus, and that a police officer in the middle of the night could mistake this huge double-decker bus for a UFO, and that he was basically being deluded. So you've got this strange tactic. You've got Clarke there basically staging arguments with people, and you've got Andy Roberts saying, well, no, most of these people that see this sort of thing are hallucinating, and numerous other tactics. Based on that, based on those little snippets to do with Max's case with the Sheffield Triangle, which again was quite a big issue, probably a bit bigger than the Berwyn one on the level of military, but not on mystery. We got Roberts and Clarke involved on that, and then this little guy called Tim Heppel, who seems to be doing a vast amount of stuff. We haven't got enough time to go into all his stuff, Tim Heppel's, but a program could be done on him alone. Did you have any other run-ins with Andy Roberts, or have you come across Dave Clarke in the time between you doing the research on Berwyn and, say, when we've seen Clarke pop up at the National Archives?
I've never ever had any run-in or communication with David Clarke. He's always been in the background. I've always had this, for the last couple of years, I've had this idea that somehow Dave Clarke is the intellectual, if you like, and he's perceived as such because of his PhD, and he's got this position of authority now, seemingly in the National Archives. It gives him the impression of importance. I don't know anything about Andy Roberts' academic background, if there is it. But whenever I've brought up the Berwyn, it's always been Andy Roberts who's had a pop at me, if you like. No one else, no other person who's involved in debunking UFOs has ever had a go at me. It's been, it seems like the Berwyn case is the sole remit of Andy Roberts. But I just always got the impression, because the two of them do together, you just get the impression like David Clarke is like Andy Roberts' boss or his superior in some way. Yeah. They work together, but one supplies the bullets in the background, and the little man goes out and shoots them. I get that impression.
Yeah.
That,
With regards to the Berwyn case, it seems that it was certainly with the Sheffield's Triangle case, then they just wanted to completely destroy that altogether. I think it's interesting that the fact it contained a flying triangle and then contained a terrestrial plane that was supposedly chasing or supporting this, that would create a huge amount of problems for them, more than a straight sort of UFO case would, which they can perhaps debunk in numerous ways. When you've got a military aircraft chasing an actual anti-gravity, obviously a fast-moving, highly efficient, unusual back then anti-gravity crafts, then you've got a real quandary for sort of the MOD and the government to deal with. What do you think of what we said that basically these, it seems that right from Tim Matthews, who began hammering this whole thing to the point actually where he's on he became an advisor on Jeff Rentz's show in the late 90s. If you go back into Jeff Rentz's big, that's huge for anyone that doesn't know. That's a really huge second to coast in the USA. And Tim Heppel became the Nazi expert on that, on how the Nazis had brought the UFO issue was essentially a Nazi-based project. Do you think about that we've got Tim Heppels with that then we've got this, any sort of issue that these crafts may be anything more than a hallucination, or are certainly implying that there's nothing actually that strange about them, and they're probably actually either missed sightings or they're perhaps some sort of military phenomena. Do you think that seems to be... What was your take on the Berwyn Mountain case with regards to that? I mean, what's your intuition about what it was about, and do you think maybe if it was ET or something else that went on, do you think the reason why Roberts has been told or has made it his job to come after you to such an extent was because your research was certainly... You seem to have unmuddled the research, so you did really well in making these very confused things that seem to have been instigated mostly by Andy Roberts, who got the British Geographical Survey reports ahead of time and managed to swap all these things around. What's your impression of what the case was actually about, and do you think that was Andy Roberts' goal with that?
Well, first of all, I'd say that these guys would stop at nothing. The remit is to bury cases and muddle them up and deter investigation. So they would stop at nothing if the backs were against the wall to achieve that end. In the case of the Berwyn, I obviously believe a craft of extraterrestrial origin came down on the mountain. It was actually UFO people themselves who invented the crash scenario. I think they were just being a bit overzealous. Yeah. And you'll find that those who are against the idea of a UFO being on the mountain, i.e. Andy, he'll actually say there was no crash, but in fact there wasn't a crash, but there was a UFO. I believe that the reason the military personnel were already in place and the reason police were already there, now Andy must know this, is because the UFO was the only way they could have been lying in wait for it was that it was actually coming down regularly. And I dug up some evidence that suggested that from people who claimed they'd seen things in the days and weeks running up to this event. Now I believe Andy Roberts knows this, but he's just chosen never actually to say anything about it because it would undermine his attack on the subject. But the only way the military and the police could have all been possible a big operation, even if they were not necessarily knew about each other, was that they were waiting for that UFO to come down. And when you're talking about the likes of this plane and the Max Burns case and planes chasing UFOs, and we're going back to 1974 now with the Berwyn case, what you've got is, even though the population of Britain was much lower than it is at the end of it today, it's inconceivable that then or now, I believe it's inconceivable, that a military plane would fire upon a landed UFO or an airborne UFO because they got no control over it. If they hit it and destroyed it or whatever, they got no idea where all that debris is going to come down, if they wouldn't, where it might crash. And the last thing they need is one landing in the middle of a town or even in the countryside, because nowhere in Britain's really remote anymore. And as every day goes by and the population grows and urban areas expand, there's less and less they can lie how to explain something away. So in the case of those lights that were approaching the UFO, which Andy tried to pass off as police torches in that fabrication, I believe that those military personnel would have been doing something anyway. They would have been studying it or whatever. But I believe their remit was not to engage it, but to basically frighten it off, to get it to move, because they had no control over it. It was doing whatever it was doing, and basically the only way they could get rid of it before the public did become aware of it was basically to shoo it away. I'm sure they would have loved to have got hold of it, or bombed it, or shot it down, or whatever. For the technology advantage they gained from it. But
I was going to say that, yeah, it was about, that all these different governments or transnational groups around the globe have basically got hold of downed crafts technology and have sort of reverse engineered this and that. So, but in that case, who saw the, just going back to going back to the Berwick case, who saw the craft actually take off? So, and then did that fit in with the timeline? Obviously, it did. The torches were seen that you think were then probably military, because you'd worked out the police were elsewhere. The craft obviously took off on its own sort of volition, but who actually saw it? Given the nurse had then left and returned back home, then who actually saw the craft take off?
There was a bit of a timeline there, because when I sort of investigated it and discovered because the rumours persisted about military being involved, and information was few and far between. And of course, Andy was going out saying, no, there was no soldiers. Anyway, we unearthed a girl who worked in a pub who was actually physically stopped in a roadblock. And there were soldiers there. In fact, it was on a minor lane, and it was a lane leading to a particular part of the mountain range where we got other information that soldiers had actually been hanging out. But again, more information came when I dug deeper. I actually got testimony about a girl who had a farm, which there was a knock on the door, and crucially about 9:30 at night, and this young girl answered the door, and her parents weren't in. It was a farm, and there was a soldier at the door, and other soldiers milling about in the yard, and it was nothing unusual because the mountain range was used by the military for exercises anyway, just sorts of people living off the land, all that sort of business, and moving about over the mountains, doing whatever they do. And what was interesting, what caught my attention, was that the guy claimed that the radios wouldn't work and could he use the phone, and the girl obliged. And the soldier went in, rung someone, and they went. Now I worked out, I got tipped off about this, and at the time the girl didn't want to be identified.
This was a really interesting part of the documentary that you did. I remember this and you can carry on with that after I finish. Didn't you also find a possible place where these soldiers were what they call billeted and put up for the night as well?
We're a bit uncertain about that now. There was a lead we were given, and so some soldiers were billeted, and we tried to get information about this, because a claim was made that the guy who owned the property at the time rented to the MOD an outbuilding which was occupied by soldiers for a period of about 6 weeks, possibly 8. But I ran into a brick wall with that, freedom of information requests and whatever, and people just claimed they had no record of it. But then it got confused because in 1982, so 12 years later, there was a military jet crashed onto the mountain range,
Right.
which was recovered. Again, Andy Roberts got involved in that, and fabricated the importance of the plane. He made it was a big military Harrier jump jet full of top secret hardware,
Okay.
to justify a lot of military recovering it. And then he said that military recovery were people getting confused with the Berwyn event 12 years earlier.
All right. Interesting.
Oh yeah, that. But in fact, when I got a full list of military plane crashes in North Wales off the MOD, which they quite happily handed over under free information request. And there was no record of any plane um, other than that one. That one crashed in 1982. And Andy Roberts had claimed another plane had crashed in 1972, 2 years before the Bear.
Getting a bit closer there, isn't he?
Yeah, he fabricated that. There was no such a crash.
Mm-hmm.
All he said in his report, another plane crashed in 1972, and he will not come forward and say where this plane was it civilian, was it military, where did it come from? Because after all military and civilian plane crashes are recorded. So I got all the military planes that crashed in North Wales in that year, in 1974, and none of them tied in with the Berwyn, none of them tied in with the previous years. Our next plane crash going backwards was actually in 1968, and it was a civilian plane crash,
Right.
and 4 people died. And I approached the CIA, and they handed over all the civilian plane crashes ever recorded in North Wales. And
Why would the CIA hold British data?
no, CAA, sorry.
Oh, sorry, CAA. Sorry, God, that was my
Civil Aviation Authority.
Right.
Yeah, and they handed over. There was no record of any of this stuff. And when the military got back in touch with me, the MOD, about they sent me the full crash details of this plane in 1982. It turned out it didn't even have a black box flight recorder in it. It was a trainer plane. It was a heap. It was a shed with a solo pilot in it, a trainee pilot.
Oh my God.
And he lost his way and crashed the plane. And Andy Roberts took that, he enhanced it, because it took him a week to recover it, bit by bit. So they cut it up, used a helicopter, and they did have an armed guard around to stop fools going there and pinching pieces of it and all this sort of business. Well, it took them a day to find it, because they didn't even know where the guy was. All they just did was search the flight path. Eventually they found his wreck. Students. Andy Roberts said it was a Harrier jump jet, laden with top secret hardware, and this is all in his write-up. Anyone can read it, it's all there. And that justified the military presence. And then the locals, thinking back, got that military presence in 82 mixed up with events in 74 to debunk the presence of soldiers.
I wouldn't put that past Andy Roberts at all now, knowing...
In 74, these soldiers turned up in this girl's yard. That was roughly 9:30, the girl claims. So we assumed that, they're possibly on the way, doing whatever they were doing. Now, I thought it was strange that the radios wouldn't work. The plural was used, radios. So I thought, well, hang on. If one radio goes wrong, that's fair enough. But if more than one, that's unusual. So I assumed, because I didn't know who this woman was to start with, that in fact these radios were perhaps being interfered with by the presence of a UFO. So I thought, well, we know roughly where the UFO was, because Pat Evans testified where she saw it. And then it was a simple matter of doing a bit of cross-referencing, and I discovered the actual farm where this girl lived. And it turned out it was true. And then we walked it, and 20 minutes later, uphill, takes you to the spot where the UFO was, which ties in with the arrival time of Pat Evans discovering the UFO just before 10 o'clock.
Excellent.
And seeing the torches going towards it.
Right.
Well, I believe that they were very, very close to this UFO, very, very close. Talking about, just a couple of 100 yards, exposed on the side of a mountain. And this thing, as Richard Hall worked out, it could have been, I think it was about 35 metres across. Big glow. So these guys were really close. And I believe whatever they were doing in 74 was very limited. And I actually believe they were there to shoo it away. They knew it had been coming down. They mounted an operation against it. But also, interestingly, on that night, there was a bolloid meteor shower. A regular one. Happens every year. Now, I believe that they chose the 23rd of January 1974 because that was the night of the meteor display. So if there was a cock-up and anyone rumbled them, you blame the meteors.
You've lost me there. Who are you saying tried to coincide what with the meteor shower?
No, on that same night, there was an earthquake, yeah? There was also a meteor shower that night, a regular annual meteor shower.
Yeah.
And I believe that the military knew this UFO was coming down for days, if not weeks before. That's why they're all in place.
But hang on, why would they know that if it was an ET craft? If it was one of their own and they were doing some sort of cordoned off test flight or something, then that would indeed make sense and would make total sense that they would try and coincide it with something like that. But
yeah, well, everyone always wondered how if it was shot down or it crashed or whatever, how could the military know in order to be there that would crash at that particular point? But of course it didn't. I discovered people who'd seen UFOs in the run up to that particular night, and that to me suggested that in fact this thing was coming down regularly. The authorities knew about it, and they chose that night to intercept it because there was a meteor shower, and if anything went wrong they could blame the meteors. As it happens, a member of the public, Pat Evans, did see what was going on, and of course if you look in Roberts' information, he uses the fact, oh well, there was a meteor shower that night, and all the witnesses are all around, miles and miles around, who claimed they saw things in the sky. All they saw were meteors, and in fact could very well have seen an extraterrestrial craft. There's some evidence that it was around for some time before the event when it was discovered. There is some evidence that suggests that possibly the same craft was still hanging around up to 3 weeks later. That's purely because there was an old guy, he's still alive, a retired gamekeeper, and he used to keep weather reports for the Met Office in those days. He used to keep daily records of the weather in a particular place where he lived. Apparently people did this all over the country and send in the reports, and it helped in the more primitive days to build up weather forecasts. We kept all these records, and he made a very interesting thing. This guy was on the way to the pub to play darts, and he turned up in the local papers with this information. He was on his way to play darts about 3 weeks after the Berwyn event. Him and two mates were with him, the two witnesses, and what was crucial is they walked into this UFO, and they described it as a squat rugby ball, just hanging there in the sky, lit up. But the guy, this is in 1974 now, he had the common sense to include it as an entry in his diary.
Right.
So that was crucial evidence. It wasn't something he just made up and said, oh, well, I remember some time ago I saw this. He actually had physically as an entry, and he described it, what he saw. And it was just amazing coincidence that it was just the other side of the very same mountain on what it was allegedly landed on, that he saw it 3 weeks later. We're not saying it's the same craft, but it could have been the same craft. And to me, it suggested it was still hanging around, and that tied in with the fact that it was also hanging around in the run-up to the Berwyn event. Now, I also tied that in possibly with the fact that people around the world claimed they could see UFOs before, during, and just after major sort of events like earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, tsunamis, all this sort of business.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking to myself, by some wonderful coincidence, there was an air tremor which was large on a Welsh scale that night, and in the run-up to it, and hanging around just after it, was this UFO. And I'm thinking to myself, did this UFO have something to do with the earthquake? Whatever was occupying the UFO, did it know an air tremor was coming? And therefore, it derives some value from it,
That's a really interesting thing as well, because you use the evidence that you can find where legitimate, let's say, off-world or whatever, however you want to frame it, crafts seem to turn up at times when volcanoes are going off and earthquakes and all sorts of ththings. There's something going on with, like you say, it could be energy, or is it interest in how the Earth functions, or is it because they're there to watch what might be a potential disaster? That happens an awful lot. I think we should, just to clear up then, are there any to try and work out perhaps what this might be, are there any military bases near to Berwyn? I'm sure you checked that. And also, has it been known historically? I'm sure, because Margaret Fry, as you said, who's written a lot of stuff, comes from that area and has written a lot of stuff to do with the whole UFO issue. Are there any bases near the Berwyn incident? And is it known for sort of paranormal activity prior to the 70s?
Well, people have always claimed mysterious goings on, not necessarily UFO sense, but all these mountains have the local customs and folklore, and strange things happen and ghostly shadows and all that sort of business. But as regards military bases, the nearest ones are actually just over the English border in Shropshire. There's Chain Hill and things like that. But it was interesting because when I mentioned earlier about the police, who I believe were already drafted in, and I don't believe they knew what they were actually there for. But I believe they were there to interfere with the public if the public became aware of something going on which no one wanted to know. But I believe senior police officers right up at the top knew what was going on and why it was going on. They knew about the military, but the ordinary policemen who were drafted in didn't. I found one reference. It was interesting because members of the public were contacting the police and saying what they were seeing and what they'd experienced with this air tremor. But one member of the public phoned into the police and must have given information to the police that they thought they saw military personnel knocking about, because one of the policemen involved this alleged plane crash, they thought it was a plane crash that night. As part of his inquiries, he made a note in the incident log to inquire of Chain Hill, which is in Shropshire. They have any military men on exercise. And that clearly suggested that some member of the public had phoned in and had seen soldiers. They weren't meant to be seen, but a member of the public had seen soldiers and reported this to the police. And of course, the police on the ground, they didn't really know what was going on. So this guy made a genuine inquiry to the military, saying, have you got any soldiers on exercise? Thinking this event had something to do with them, you know. Yeah. And of course, they actually told the police no. But of course, people at Chain Hill don't necessarily know that the other military units operating in the area, especially if they officially don't exist. And I don't believe the soldiers who were up on the Berwyn exist, if you know what I mean. Yeah. It probably is some sort of black operation.
When it involves direct retrieval of ET kit and stuff like that, or even some issue of where some covert project craft may have got into trouble, then they usually use sort of special forces. Really, they don't want average Joe Blogg soldier to be exposed to this sort of stuff. But that makes total sense. The more you go on about it, the more it sounds to me like it was. They were pretty fast at it sounds like they knew about this, and like you say, they'd for the civilian side of things in the town, they'd got that under control with the police. They got this ring with the military, and maybe some. It's unusual also for a soldier to be. This soldier that was dressed up and that you traced and that knocked on someone's door. Unusual for one, unless they're special forces, for one soldier to be on their own. Soldiers work in they hardly like to get split up really, and they tend to work.
That soldier who knocked on the door, I did mention it earlier. I think he spoke to the girl, but there were other soldiers in the yard behind him.
Watching the documentary, I thought he'd walk down on his own.
No. I think it was portrayed in the documentary like that. Mm-hmm. But in fact, there were several soldiers, but only one spoke to the girl, and he was the one who used the telephone.
Yeah.
But it seemed to already been up on the hill, and radios didn't work, so they had to speak to someone. So they came back down, spoke to someone on the phone, and then they went back up, and that was their lights that were seen approaching the UFO. Oh yeah, they were definitely ready. But for years, people wondered why. Well, how could they possibly know? Mm-hmm. And of course, when I dug up witnesses saying they'd seen UFOs in the run-up to it, I thought, well, hang on, maybe that's the way they did know it was coming, because it was a regular event. So on this particular night, they were waiting for it, and it showed up.
From that, the whole thing you described about the case actually on the night that it took place, for a sort of smallish Welsh town, then there was a huge amount going on. That sort of seems to me then to be mirrored by the fact that you then get people like Clark and Roberts being so determined to make sure that this case, like you say, all the results return Andy Roberts' name on the internet when you look this up, to make sure that they retain control of the narrative of this situation. Even 20, 30, 40 years later, they're still sort of they're still at it.
Well, I have the opinion, and I think we can all be rest assured on this, to the point that when you get people like Andy Roberts and David Clark and others going to such lengths about particular cases, and in the case of Max Burns with the plane crash, you could be pretty well certain that out of all the cases that people report, many of which perhaps aren't really UFO cases, but genuine mistaken identities, you can bet your life that the ones they pay most attention to and go out of the way and spend money on trying to debunk our genuine cases.
I couldn't agree with you more, and that's the point I was making when I said that with regards to David Clark, when Max used to visit him in the Sheffield Star paper at the offices, and that he kept coming back and having these staged arguments with him, and very much the way that Roberts has been with you on the internet, and sort of having a go at your evidence, and claiming that this case has been completely sewn up by only himself, and I totally agree. I think a lot of people are a bit slow. That, to me, that's a really obvious point about the way disinformation works. That it also works that the most attention they give to something, if something was just a simple case that it could be brushed off really easily as something, then you don't get people clinging to these narratives and saying, well, this is exactly what's happening, and getting angry about it. And it doesn't happen. They just right, you just move on and do something else. So I think a lot of people miss that, where there's this overzealous response from these state structures.
I'm a great believer. This is me personally. I'm a great believer that no matter how technologically advanced these things are, wherever they come from, when they invade these days near Earth space, and when they invade our atmosphere, and then when they over in the airspace, when they enter the airspace of individual sovereign states, despite our technology, I think the authorities on Earth know every time these things turn up. It doesn't matter how smart they are, they know. So when people make claims they see UFOs, if it doesn't tie in with what they know, then I think they just assume that people don't really see a UFO. They've seen something that they've mistaken for a UFO,
My contention has been, since spending right from 1999 onwards, looking at the supposed chemtrail phenomenon that I believe has absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with global warming. And my research is that one of the functions of chemtrails, probably linked to something like some electromagnetic system, HARP essentially, with chemtrails, you essentially makes electromagnetic plasma in the air. That's essentially what it does. This then becomes a 3D mapping situation, where then with appropriate technology you can then look at a 3D map of both the ground and the sky above it, and you can literally have this cross section of, at an instant moment's notice, literally in the whole coverage, where they've got these chemtrails which are global, then you can get this pattern of what's going on in the skies. So my contention is that chemtrails have nothing to do with global warming, or exactly what you said, that this is a shared US, British, European technology. That's why these planes are allowed to fly anywhere they want around the globe, and no one bats an eyelid, and no one is saying anything about it, because I think the UFO issue is that important for what we count as, quote, our security, that the military, as you say, know exactly when these things are turning up. That the moment they drop into this plasma-like soup that's created by these barium and aluminium particles that are turned into this plasma, that they get these full indicators of when, no matter how small these objects are, they know when they are.
It's actually a great labour saving, and even perhaps a money saving device for the authorities. 1 million people a day report UFOs all over the world, Yeah. Of course, there aren't 1 million UFOs, and that would tie up resources if the sources are looking at each individual claim. So if they know what's coming in, and they know where it is, and what path it takes around the world and things like that, if people say they've seen a UFO and it fits in with what they've seen, then clearly they know that a witness has seen a genuine UFO, and it's in their interest then to interfere with that witness. Of course, people who say, oh, I saw a UFO today and it flew across the sky, and the authorities get wind of it, and then they say, oh, well, there was nothing there. They just say it's mistaken identity, and they don't have to waste the resources. You just ignore that person and concentrate the resources and the effort on those who do genuinely see, because they're the problem. People who see things that are genuine.
That's another really astute point that you just made. If their observation technology is that good, and if they are, as we suspect, that certain governments or transnational military cabals are flying their own versions of these anti-gravity devices, then of course they'll probably have some way of monitoring which are their own and which are, quote, alien, or not on the terrestrial side. So they, like you say, that then saves time. It's almost like a identification friend or foe thing that they use in the military to stop friendly fire. That they can tell when these things are have come in from other situations, and what's been launched from our own planet. The technology is light years ahead, and I just think this UFO issue is far more important than most people realise.
I think that actually stemmed from the Cold War, because my belief on that is there are many claimed instances where could have all been involved in nuclear annihilation with it, the Soviets against the West, and vice versa, because of misidentification of inbound UFOs. People thinking, oh, it's an ICBM coming in, type thing, and we're very close to pushing a button against, say, the Soviet Union, when the Soviet Union hadn't actually done anything. So the need arose to identify what was real and what wasn't.
Yeah.
But they could never admit to these UFOs coming in and making a mistake. And certainly they could never admit to the potential to make the mistake of nuking each other,
Yeah.
because the UFO was misidentified. So therefore you have the incentive to create the technology to identify them.
And to share that technology. It seems to be it's only the USSR which seems to not have these. Again, if I'm right with this chemtrail series, only the USSR that seems to have not allowed these planes to every other continent. They're allowed over. And I think that's a good point. That during the Rendlesham event, the world was Britain was far closer to being actually the base where nuclear weapons were launched from during that year, and that close to that Christmas period. Interesting again that an supposed ET event happened there at Rendlesham, because apparently that was one of the closest we came to actually launching these things. So by 1998, 99, we were then spraying this aluminium stuff everywhere and getting this bullshit concept that it's all to protect the Earth from global warming. Well, I'm sorry, I don't buy. I think corporations and the various governments are quite happy to trash the planet. I don't think they're going to be too arsed about global warming. I'm going to finish here. Thanks for coming on. That was a really good chat, and I think if anyone wants to look into what Scott found out about the Berwyn case, because he really done well in taking that case apart, given what we found out, that primarily Andy Roberts and probably several other people that we may not know that have did the water to a degree and really made it quite a mess in the usual way that disinformation assets tend to do that, and Scott's done a really good job at dealing with that. But from what we've found out about Roberts and David Clarke and this other guy Tim Heppel, I just wanted to read out something that I found in the article from Notes from the Borderland, from the Article magazine, that looked into Tim Heppel's as this state asset, his operation, his modus operandi. They list 10 points here. I'll just run through them quickly. You could probably apply these when you look into what happened to Andy Roberts, both with the Berwyn case and many others, and with David Clarke and what he did with the Flying Triangles incident and many other cases. Then you'll get these and probably other ones that you can think of. So apart from this list for the modus operandi of essentially a disinformation asset for the state or the military, number one, urging others to undertake illegal activities. Obviously, that compromises people and in various ways. Number two, immunity from the law for the person that's obviously in charge of the situation as the state asset. I like this one, address list kleptomania, which I thought was quite funny, because again, notice that David Clarke, the moment he got Max Burns' new address, then it just so happens that he sent a fax off with all his details, private details, to the council, who then got the police to come and arrest him because he was being naughty and looking into these Flying Triangle incidents. Number four, setting up a transient dummy groups and publications. Number five, trying to induce us to publish compromising information. Number six, disrupting groups. We see lots of that. Rapid changes of allegiance. Utter disregard for truth or loyalty to everyone. We're at number 9 now. Pulling stunts when under suspicion. Pathological addiction to violence. Well, I think it seems that Dave Clarke's got a pretty foul temper. And I've got number 11 here. Support from powerful allies. And there's probably many more we could add to that. But you've heard from what Scott said about his run-ins with Andy Roberts, that he ticks a few of those boxes, and when you look into David Clarke, so does he. I don't know if you want to add anything else, Scott. That's been great. If there's anything else you want to add about the case, what you do now? Are you still chasing up the Berwyn thing, or have you moved on to other stuff?
Still chasing the Berwyn. The people keep saying things like, "Oh, why don't you write a book?" But one of the things about that is the day I finish writing and the day it's published, something new will crop up, and the book's suddenly out of date. It's one of those things. It's a really dynamic thing, And
well, I think has Andy Roberts done a book on the Counties Bank? Did he do?
Yeah, he's published various things. He rushed a small book that's out for publication just before the UFO Matrix mag last January, I think it was February, published an article which I did, and head to head with Andy. He knew what I was going to write, and I did what he was going to write, but he already put his bog standard stuff in anyway, because he was so confident that I had nothing to say, you know. And that put his nose out of joint. But he wrote a small book on the Berwyn, but he still ran and was telling people this is the definitive answer to the Berwyn mystery, you know. And there's nothing definitive about it at all, because stuff's emerging every day. So even if I was wrong at the end of the day, he's still wrong for saying that, because the case isn't proved one way or the other, you know. I know full well, I believe full well, a craft of extraterrestrial origin landed on the side of the Berwyn, did whatever it was doing, and it left. It could have been provoked into leaving, but it left somewhat peaceably as well. And there was evidence that some of the surface damage was removed by 4 soldiers and a couple of boxers, probably just evidence of a landing, you know. But I also believe that no matter how good these things are, they never ever clean up the ground as well as you should do when these things land. And I actually, well, I know roughly to within a couple of 100 square meters where this thing was. And I believe that it's possible, and it's something I will go down, a route I will take. It's possible to still extract evidence that will prove such a craft landed, you know. That's my ultimate aim.
People, and they get to know landscapes very well. If you've lived in a certain area and driven around it, then you know that. The one thing I wanted to point out: do you still believe today that, and because I would say that based on what we're about to discuss, to do related to both Andy Roberts and David Clark, we also found this with the Rendlesham case, that just by moving, which Colonel Holt did, not any suspicions him, by moving one of the dates, just tweaking a date and a few times a little bit on the 3-day period of Rendlesham, it threw out researchers for years. So do you still today believe, based on what I think we've discussed off this recording briefly regards to Andy Roberts, that he uses certain, let's say, what could be classed as intelligence or disinformation tactics? Do you still believe that he believes that the mountain was actually used, or is your opinion today that that was a piece of disinformation to throw people off the scene?
I believe, from what I've discovered since, with documents I eventually got my hands on, which Andy Roberts claimed he had access to, and which various people in the British Geological Survey frustrated me for 2 years getting. He knew, I believe he knew from day one all the true facts about the Berwyn event. There was no dispute, I don't believe there's any dispute about that. He knew there was a UFO on the side of Cad y Berwyn, on the slopes of Cad y Berwyn. He knew, because he had access to all the records, everything that went on surrounding the event, all the actual stuff, all the peripheral stuff. He knew that, and out of that, he concocted a story to rubbish the UFO event, and relied on documents and maps and all sorts of things which he had access to, which no one else had access to, and he relied on others then to refuse access to those documents so that he could get away with what he said.
Yeah, I wanted to go into the British Geological Survey, because that, I think, is highly significant given what you had to do to get those documents. Just before we move on to that bit and we move on to sort of that second phase of what we're going to talk about, it's interesting, we've got, you can correct me if I'm right, I think Jenny Randall's claimed that these things, the problem is, you know, like you say, what a weird coincidence that you have a sort of mini quake in that area on the same night or the same day, because of course when you have geological or what are essentially magnetic instances taking place within the earth and stuff, then you do actually, there is a phenomena which people, debunkers use, and is a real phenomena, that you start getting like these mini aurora borealis things, so you start getting lights coming off the ground.
Lights.
Is that what they're called? Yeah, and I think Jenny Randall said that Berwyn was linked to that. I think she claims, or someone that has done that. So I mean, given that we've now got the theory that, right, so it could have been the quake again to do with these electromagnetic lights. It could be a crash of either a UFO or a plane, depending on who you talk to. And then on top of that, there's the third one, of course, is the poacher's lamp was what was creating. Poachers use these. If anyone doesn't know or is listening outside the UK, then lamping is used, is really powerful, usually on the side of a Land Rover, but if not, you can get these sort of million watt, million candle watt, whatever they're called, million candle power lamps that essentially, I think they're made to sort of, they highlight the animals' eyes up and make them stand there, then they get shot basically. But so these lamps are really bright, but again, you've got to imagine then that would someone like Pat Evans, who was used to the ways of the countryside, used to viewing things like lamping and poaching taking place, would she mistake a poacher's lamp for standing and staring at what
She never actually knew it was a poacher's lamp one way or the other.
No, I meant she would be aware of what a poacher's lamp was in comparison to what she
Oh
saw
yeah,
on the high
yeah,
hillside.
she would. But I was fortunate. I've had a because of police incompetence that she actually came across it, because they were obviously involved in trying to stop people moving about, and as a consequence of their own lives, she ended up in a place where she shouldn't have been and came across it. But that's another story. But that was Pat Evans. She was the local district nurse, and she had two daughters who were trained in first aid. And on that particular night, it was just a normal night. No one would have thought anything about it, except that just after 8:30 there was an air tremor, and the air tremor took place. It was quite a powerful one for North Wales, and all over the affected area. And the affected area was like went out into England as far as Manchester, 60-mile radius. People came out of the houses in various villages around the Berwyn mountain range, which is a range of hills about 10 miles long, runs roughly north to south. And people in one particular village, Llandrillo, they saw lights on the mountain. Couple that with the idea of this earthquake, and there was also an explosion sound reported amongst the rumblings. And when they came out of the houses in Llandrillo, they saw lights on the side of the mountain, and quickly concluded that in fact they thought a plane had crashed. Now this was on one mountain in a particular part of the range. In the next village, which was 3 miles away, Llanderfel, Pat Evans is the nurse. That's where she lived. She also suffered the effects of the earthquake, the air tremor, and this was about 20 to 9. She spent the next sort of 3/4 of an hour trying to ring the police because all the phone lines were jammed, and eventually just before 9:30 got through to the police in headquarters at Colwyn Bay up on the coast. Now by then they'd already organised a major incident log because they thought it was a crash in one part of the range. And she said who she was and what her status was, and she offered her assistance. Now by 9:10, a good 15 minutes before she even spoke to the police had already authorised local officers, and who turned out actually to be drafted in policemen who were already in position to go up and look for this suspected plane crash.
How do you know how many hours after that was since Pat Evans saw the actual craft on this what was the side of a hill, if I remember?
Yeah, well, that was just before 10 p.m. She spoke to the police just about 9:30. Right. The police already knew where they thought a suspected plane crash had happened, and they thought casualties. They accepted her offer of medical assistance, bearing in mind this was a major incident log was opened, and they thought it could have been casualties in a possible quite a large plane crash. However, everything the police did was very, very peculiar, because it defied all logic about how you would deal with a major incident of that sort of magnitude, even though they did open a major incident log. And the strange thing was, they accepted her offer of help, but they didn't tell her where to go to.
Right.
So she took a particular road over the mountain range, which turned out to be, and eventually they turned up in Richard Hall's documentary. They basically sort of controlled landing. But what was interesting is that within a short space of time, when this earthquake took place at 20 to 9, roughly, the police were in numbers already in that particular village in the local police station. So the question had to be asked, well, why were all these policemen already there? And also, crucially, they weren't local. They were all being
They've been drafted in. That's really unusual. You know, that takes a lot of organising usually.
Yeah, well, they were already there, but the locals in the village didn't know they were there. And this earthquake, which no one could have predicted, basically flushed them out.
Right.
Now, the police who were in the village now come to conclude that they were just ordinary bobbies. They'd been drafted in. They could have been told a load of rubbish about why they were actually there. I believe they were there because if the public got to know about an operation that was going on in the mountains involving the military, their job would have been to interfere with the public.
Right.
As it happens, this earth tremor happened, coincidental, I believe, and as a result of that, the locals all ringing into the police and saying, well, we think there's a plane crash here, and the switchboards were jammed anyway because of the earthquake. The police had no choice but to open a major incident log and send some officers up onto the mountain to look for this suspected plane, which had nothing to do with the UFO. It was a totally different tangent. And where this alleged plane might have crashed was a good 4 miles from where the UFO was. It was on a totally different mountain in the range.
Right, interesting.
Now, in the end, in this Roswell concoction by Andy Roberts, he moved events on the mountain called Cadabronwen, which is above the village of Llanrhichlo where the police were, and he moved them to 4 miles to the neighbouring mountain, Cadaberwyn, to explain away what Pat Evans saw. Now, what the villagers saw in Llanrhichlo when they came out of the houses, they saw lights on the mountain, but they turned out to be the lamp. That turned out to be the lamp of a group of lads who were all hunting rabbits. They were lamping the rabbits in the dark and shooting them. And that was pure coincidence. What actually happened with Andy Roberts, he took the poachers' story because it couldn't be disputed. They were there.
Yep.
He moved their lamp in his ignorance, because he didn't understand the actual method of lamping rabbits and hares and whatnot at night. Okay. He moved them to the neighbouring mountain and said their lamp was what Pat Evans saw. And then he fabricated a story that the police conducted a foot search with torches because he knew and couldn't dispute that police had gone up the mountain looking for this plane. So he took their actions, said that he invented a story that he did a foot search, and not only that, but enlarged it further and said that these little lights, these torch lights which Pat Evans saw, were police torches, and they not only met with the poachers, but they stopped and spoke with them.
Right.
But it never happened.
No.
The police never met the poachers, and also they were on a neighbouring mountain anyway. Well, 4 miles, count for what she saw.
Yeah, well, you think someone as local as Pat Evans would know exactly what mountain to report and to say that she saw this thing on. If you've lived in an area, and you know, people that come from sort of valleys and rural areas have got sort of different mindset to town. Right, hi there. We're talking to Scott Felton today, and this is part of our interview series of discussions. Scott's like third in that series. Yeah, I heard of Scott around for quite some years and emailed him several years ago. I've been on his email list and had a few chats about various things, especially in the Welsh, regards to Welsh cases, because that's what Scott's interested in. Mostly he's known for, especially since a documentary that was shown at the last Leeds Exopolitics event on the Berwyn Mountain case, which is from the 70s, and was actually quite an interesting case that Scott's really up on. So hi to Scott, thanks for joining us, and do you want to give us a bit of your background, because I don't know too much. I know you run Conway UFO Group. I don't know if you want to say sort of when you got into all this and what you do with that group, and then perhaps go on to say a bit about the main case you studied and the one that you did the documentary on with Richard Hall, which was the Berwyn case. Do you want to give us a little summary of the Berwyn Mountain case, which you're very up on?
Yeah, well, for those who don't know, the Berwyn Mountain UFO event, it's often described as a crash event. I've come to learn in later years, I don't actually believe it was a crash. I think it was just a controlled landing, and in due course the object lifted off the ground and went on its way. But it was quite a while ago now, 23rd of January 1974. There was a series of events went on the same night. There was things like a meteor shower, there was an earth tremor, um, natural events. And as a result of those natural events, especially the earth tremor, it provoked people into coming out of their homes on what would otherwise be a cold, dark January night. And as a result of people being out and about, certain things were seen, including this object that was perched on the side of a mountain. And other things came to light. For instance, numbers of policemen who seemed to be already in position in a particular village, claims of military personnel being about, and that escalated into things like roadblocks and people being questioned about where they were going on the particular night. And they've got this whole plethora of different things going on.
There was one first-hand witness, wasn't there? Was this the lady that went out with her daughter after seeing it from a house, and was she a nurse or something? I can't remember. Do you want to tell us exactly what she saw? Because her testimony is actually quite vivid still, and I should have mentioned this at the start, but basically, after discussing the Berwyn case, because what that Scott's found is that Andy Roberts, who's a prominent sort of old-school UFOologist, who has links to Dr. David Clarke, who currently is in charge of the National Archives, or does PR for the government for that, and so we're going to go on to say about how disinformation campaigns are spread in ufology, and why a certain two, and you also get a name also including one called Tim Matthews or Tim Heppel, also come up. So you've got a group of three that historically from the 80s have debunked cases, and Scott's ran into this problem with one of these three, linked to David Clarke, which was Andy Roberts. Was I right? Was it a nurse or not? What she saw? Because I thought the way she described it was really quite interesting.
Yeah. Well, there was a local district nurse, Pat Evans, her name is. She's still very much alive, and she still lives in the area. She actually came across the object perched on the side of a mountain, and it was pure, I would say, coincidence that she came across it. But I ultimately found that it was actually 5 miles from where the police were searching, and came across this big object on the side of the hill, about a mile off the road she was on. And of course she stopped sort of in amazement. She had the two daughters where they were witnesses. The debunkers have actually always made it look like it was her in the car on her own. They very rarely mentioned the daughters, basically to try and dilute testimony. In fact, there were 3 witnesses, herself and 2 daughters. She watched it for a while, drove on, turned round, came back and watched it for a bit longer. That took her to about 10:15, and then she saw small lights zigzagging towards the object. Now she thought that whatever it was on the mountain. She didn't think it was a plane crash because it was just like this consistent moon-shaped glow, but it was changing in colour, orange, yellows, sort of red, that type thing. She didn't know what it was, but when she saw these little lights zigzagging towards her, she thought it was some sort of rescue party or, the authorities. So she couldn't do anything because it was a mile across country anyway, treacherous country. So she just basically about turned and went home. And from her point of view, nothing really happened until the next day. There's some conjecture over that now because there are rumours that she received some sort of payments to change her story at a later date. But at the time, she saw this, her daughter saw it, and they could do nothing about it. So they actually went home. That was the end of it, as far as they were concerned. But that didn't last long because they got caught up in all this UFO stuff within 24 hours. It turned out, in my research, is that these little lights weren't police torches at all, although it was portrayed as police torches by Andy Roberts. Because he fabricated a story about them meeting the poachers, and this big object she saw was a poacher's lamp. It was absolute rubbish. And I found in my research is that, in fact, the evidence points to these lights were actually torches of a military unit that was approaching the object.
Well, just clear up then. Do you think the police were told to, it sounded to me like there was some sort of radar tracking. The police knew about it when she called, and as you say, didn't then send us to the right location, despite saying, yeah, you're okay to go there and help. So what confuses me is, how come, if the police knew all about it and you say they were quite prepared, why weren't the cops there either before she arrived or or while she was looking at this light on the side? What do you think happened? Do you think the police will stand down and the military turned up? What happened?
No, no, the military were already there.
Right, did she know they were there?
No,
Right.
the military were already there, and
How do you know this?
because the military were actually approaching this object within a short space of time. The object, we've dug up other witnesses now, which actually basically saw this thing land. I mean, that Pat Evans in there, she never saw it land, she never saw it take off, but she did miss it taking off by within 10 minutes.
That's right, yeah, I remember.
She's actually stated this. She was sorry that she never stayed around longer,
Yeah.
and she would have seen this thing lift off. But other witnesses since then come forward. I tracked some down who vanished, who Margaret Fry knew about, and we found